Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, October 1878. The air held the sharp, clean scent of fallen oak leaves and the promise of a killing frost. Along the slate-gray waters of the Lehigh River, homesteads were battening down, the rhythmic chunk of axe on wood a constant prayer against the coming cold. On every cleared acre, smoke rose thin and straight from stone chimneys, a sign of sensible men doing sensible things. And then there was the work of Stefan Harubi. 9 feet from the solid north wall of his modest cabin, a structure was rising that defied all local logic. It was a firebox, monstrous and black, welded from thick plates of cast iron into a box the size of a small wagon bed. It stood naked to the elements, connected to the house by nothing more than a thick, insulated iron throat that plunged into the log wall. Men hauling timber down the lane would stop their teams and just stare. They saw a furnace where no furnace should be. They saw a man building his fire out in the yard where the wind could steal every lick of warmth. "He's putting the fox in charge of the hen house and the fire in charge of the winter wind," said Wilbur Eaches, the valley's most respected mason. Eaches, a Pennsylvania Dutchman whose family had been laying stone in these hills for a century, stood with his arms crossed, his gaze critical and unforgiving. He was watching Stefan mortar a course of bricks on an interior flue, a flue that snaked illogically from the iron plates set in the wall. Every BTU generated in that box has to cross 9 feet of open air. It's foolishness, plain and simple. He's building a monument to wasted cordwood. Thomas Albright and Jedediah Miller, farmers whose cabins were built to Eaches's sound specifications, nodded in agreement. "The Slovak is a fine iron worker," Miller allowed, "but he knows nothing of a Pennsylvania winter. The man is mad." The word spread through the valley, carried with wagon loads of corn and bushels of apples. The mad iron worker, the man warming the outdoors. The children on their way to the schoolhouse would whisper and point at the strange black box. A piece of the foundry dropped inexplicably in a fallow field. Stefan Harubi, hearing the whispers and seeing the pointing fingers, simply troweled another line of mortar, his movements methodical and serene. He was not building for them. What did this Slovak iron worker, a man who came from a world of forge hammers and charcoal fires, understand about the deep physics of thermal mass radiation that a master mason, a man who had built 50 unbreachable hearths, had so completely missed? The answer to that question would not be written in words, but in the brutal arithmetic of a winter that would test every ounce of conventional wisdom and leave an entire valley shivering in the dark. It is a story of quiet knowledge against loud opinion, and how the most powerful solutions are often the ones that look, to the uninitiated eye, like absolute madness. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental difference between the heat that warms the air and the heat that warms your bones, a principle that modern building science is only now rediscovering. Before we unpack that, help support our exploration of forgotten wisdom by subscribing to the channel and tapping the like button. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen to a common problem? Stefan Harubi was not a carpenter. He did not think in terms of dovetail joints or the seasoning of oak. He was not a farmer, attuned to the subtleties of soil and seed. He was a Hamornik, an iron worker from a small village in the Spiš region of Slovakia, a land of deep forests and iron-rich mountains. His world had not been one of wood, but of fire, ore, and stone. His hands knew the heft of the forge hammer, the gritty texture of casting sand, the searing heat radiating from a pig iron bloom. He understood that heat was a wild animal, and to use it, you did not invite it into your home. You tamed it in a cage of stone and iron and taught it to work for you from a distance. In his village, the heart of the home's warmth was the stuba, a massive masonry oven, often fired from an adjoining kitchen or even from outside. that shared a thick wall with the main living space. The fire never entered the room, but its steady, radiant life did. When Stefan, his wife Katerina, and their two small children, Jan and Zuzana, arrived in the Lehigh Valley, they built as their neighbors built. They raised a log cabin, chinked it with mud and moss, and installed a fine cast-iron Franklin stove, the pinnacle of American heating technology. The first winter of 1877 was their education in its failure. The stove was a tyrant. It blazed with a fierce, consuming heat that made the air around it shimmer. To stand near it was to feel your skin tighten. Stefan's palms were scorched from feeding its insatiable appetite. Yet this bubble of violent heat was small and weak. Step 6 feet away, and the parlor's air bit through wool coats. The problem wasn't the stove's power. It was the nature of its heat. It heated the air, and the air, thin and flighty, immediately sought escape through 1,000 unseen cracks in the walls and ceiling. The logs of the cabin themselves remained cold, their immense mass acting as a heat sink, constantly pulling warmth out of the room. At night, when the fire died, the cold would reclaim the space in moments. Stefan would watch the frost patterns creep up the bedposts, their delicate white tracery a beautiful, silent threat. On the small writing desk, the ink in its well froze solid, though it sat only a foot from the stovepipe. That winter, the family lived huddled in a small circle of convective warmth, while the house itself remained a block of ice. The conventional failure was not unique to the Hruby family. It was the shared, miserable secret of the entire valley. The standard American frontier cabin, for all its rugged charm, was a thermal catastrophe. Its design was locked in a battle against the wrong enemy. Settlers fought the cold air, when they should have been fighting the cold mass of their own homes. A Franklin stove, or even a large stone fireplace, operates primarily on the principle of convection. It rapidly heats the air in a room. Hot air is less dense than cold air, so it immediately rises to the ceiling. There, it presses outward, finding every crack, every gap in the chinking, every poorly fitted window frame, and escapes into the winter. Cold, dense air is simultaneously pulled in from below to replace it, creating the drafts that made life so unbearable. A candle placed on the floor would flicker violently, its flame bent sideways by the river of frigid air flowing across the rough-hewn planks. Wilbur Eakes's fireplaces were masterworks of the craft, drawing smoke up the flue with perfect efficiency. But they, too, primarily heated the air. A family could roast on one side and freeze on the other. The immense stone of the chimney itself was a monument to the problem. Most of the fire's energy, up to 90% of it, went straight up the flue, warming the crows and the stars. The stone surrounding the firebox would warm, yes, but its heat radiated primarily into a room already filled with superheated, escaping air. The moment the fire was banked for the night, the convection cycle stopped, and the stored heat in the stones was quickly overwhelmed by the frigid mass of the surrounding log walls. For the Albright family, this meant waking up to a skin of ice on the water bucket every morning. For Jedediah Miller, it meant a winter-long cough for his youngest child, who slept in the coldest corner of the cabin. They burned through cords of wood at an astonishing rate, their days consumed by the relentless labor of felling, splitting, and hauling, only to purchase a few hours of fleeting, drafty warmth. The problem wasn't a lack of fuel or a failure of effort. The problem was physics. Stefan began his solution in late summer. He traded his ironworking skills at the local foundry for several massive 1-inch thick plates of cast iron, the kind used for industrial furnace floors. He spent weeks in his small smithy, cutting and welding them into the firebox, a colossal cube measuring 5 feet on each side, with a heavy latch door and a simple draft control. This he mounted on a foundation of fieldstone 9 feet from the northern wall of his cabin, the wall that faced the worst of the winter winds. The neighbors watched this first phase with detached curiosity. It was when he took his saw to the wall of his own home that the mockery began in earnest. He cut a precise 2-foot square opening through the logs. Into this, he sealed a single 14-inch square plate of cast iron, a half-inch thick, its surface flush with the interior wall of the parlor. This plate was the heart of the system. He then connected the external firebox to this plate assembly using a heavily insulated iron duct, packed with a mixture of clay and sand to minimize heat loss over the 9-foot gap. Wilbur Ekis tapped the duct with a knuckle. "Iron transfers heat, Ruby," he said, his tone that of a teacher correcting a slow student. "Every inch of this pipe is a leak. You're losing heat to the open air between the firebox and the house. It's the very definition of inefficiency." Stefan, fitting a brick, did not look up. "The fire is outside," he said quietly. "The heat will be inside." From the interior iron plate, the next stage of the work began. This was the part that baffled Ekis the mason most of all. Instead of a simple metal stovepipe going straight up through the roof, Stefan began constructing a flue from brick. But this flue did not go straight up. It snaked, running horizontally for 10 feet through the main parlor at bench height, its top surface flat and wide. It then turned a gentle corner and ran another 10 feet through the kitchen, before finally turning upward and venting through the roof. The entire serpentine structure was over 25 feet long, a massive brick radiator occupying the core of the small cabin. Katarina watched him lay the final brick, a look of practical concern on her face. "It is a very large bench, Stefan," she said, her Slovak accent softening the words. "A strange place for a bench." He only smiled. The total cost was $12 for the brick and mortar, plus his own labor and the bartered iron. He would use less than a third of the wood his neighbors did. He was building a system that asked not for a raging, constant fire, but for a short, violent one. The mockery lasted through the autumn. The validation would last for a generation. To understand the genius of Stefan Ruby's design is to understand the fundamental difference between convective and radiant heat. Convection, the method of a Franklin stove, is the transfer of heat through the movement of a fluid, in this case air. It's fast, inefficient, and heats the space unevenly. Radiant heat, the principle behind the Slovak stube and Stefan's stove wall, is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves, primarily in the infrared spectrum. It is the same way the sun warms the earth. It does not heat the air directly. It travels through the air and is absorbed by the solid objects it strikes: walls, floors, furniture, and people. The conventional stove wastes its energy heating the air. A single cubic foot of air at sea level requires only 0.018 British thermal units, BTUs, of energy to raise its temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It has very little capacity to hold heat. A cubic foot of dense brick, by contrast, requires about 24 BTUs to raise its temperature by 1 degree, over 1,300 times more energy. This capacity to absorb and store thermal energy is called thermal mass. Stefan's entire system was designed not to heat the air, but to pour thousands of BTUs into 2 massive heat sinks: the 14-inch iron plate in the wall and the 25-foot-long brick flue snaking through the house. Here's how it worked. In the morning, Stefan would load the wagon-sized external firebox with wood and light a hot, fast-burning fire. The inferno inside the iron box would reach temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The superheated gas and smoke, instead of going straight up a chimney, were funneled through the insulated duct directly to the interior. The first thing they hit was the back of the cast iron plate set in the wall. Iron has a high thermal conductivity. It absorbed this ferocious heat and transferred it through its half-inch thickness to the interior surface, which began to glow with a deep, radiant warmth. The temperature of this interior plate would stabilize around 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot to the touch, but not dangerously so. It was a silent, unmoving sun on the north wall. The hot gases, having given up some of their initial energy, then began their slow, 25-foot journey through the horizontal brick flue. The bricks, with their enormous thermal mass, acted like a sponge, soaking up the remaining energy. By the time the exhaust gases finally exited the roof, they were often less than 250 degrees Fahrenheit, having transferred over 80% of the fire's energy into the mass of the house itself. After just 2 hours of burning, the fire would be allowed to die out. But the work of the stove wall was just beginning. The iron plate and the tons of brick, now saturated with thermal energy, became a massive, gentle radiator. For the next 12 to 18 hours, they would steadily release this stored heat as long-wave infrared radiation, warming every surface in the 3 rooms. The floorboards became warm. The table became warm. The very bones of the people inside the cabin became warm. There were no drafts because the air itself wasn't being churned. There was only a profound, silent, and deeply penetrating warmth. The ice arrived in the second week of January. It began not as snow, but as a cold, relentless rain falling from a sky the color of lead. For 5 days, it coated every surface, every tree branch, every blade of dormant grass in a sheath of clear, perfect ice. The valley became a world of glass, beautiful and treacherous. The weight was immense. The sickening crack of ancient hickories and oaks echoed day and night as limbs, and then entire trees, surrendered to the load. By the 3rd day, the radial ice accumulation on every branch was 1.5 inches thick. Then on the 5th night, the sky cleared and the temperature plunged. By dawn, it was 19 degrees below zero. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a siege. The drafts became knives of frigid air. The ice on the logs made the already cold walls even colder, sucking heat from the rooms with terrifying speed. Families burned through their wood supply at a frantic pace, feeding their stoves and fireplaces constantly, just to maintain a small pocket of survivable air. At the Miller farm, they hung blankets over the doorways and moved the children's beds into the kitchen, crowding around the hearth. Even so, the water in the bucket by the door froze solid. At the Albright homestead, the windows were opaque with a 1/2 inch of interior frost, and the family slept in their coats, hats, and boots. The labor of keeping warm was exhausting, a full-time job for every able-bodied person. Inside Stefan Hruby's cabin, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. Twice a day, for 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening, Stefan fed a roaring fire into the great black box outside. For the other 20 hours, there was only silence. The air inside was not hot or stuffy. It was just not cold. It held a steady, even 68 degrees. Jan and Zuzana played on the floorboards in their woolen socks, the wood itself a source of gentle warmth. Katerina found the long, flat top of the brick flue in the kitchen was a perfect place for slow cooking. A pot of stew left there would simmer for hours, and the dough for her bread would rise, with a steady, reliable perfection. The profound quiet was the most noticeable difference. There was no crackle and spit of a nearby fire, no roar of a draft up the chimney. There was only the low hum of a house breathing warmth. The proof of this strange new reality sat on a small stool in the parlor. Before bed, Katerina had brought in the pail of fresh milk from their lone cow, and out of habit placed it against the warmest wall, the north wall with the iron plate. At dawn, when Wilbur Ekis was chipping a frozen cap of cream off his own milk pail, Stefan poured a full, sweet, entirely liquid stream from his. The wall itself had kept it from freezing. Wilbur Ekis was riding toward the Miller place. Jedediah had sent word that the sudden, deep cold had cracked the mortar in his chimney from top to bottom, a common result of thermal shock. Aegis was cold, his beard stiff with frozen breath, his mood as foul as the weather. A mile from Stefan's property, his path was blocked. A massive hickory, a giant of the old forest, had finally succumbed to the ice and fallen squarely across the lane. It would take a day's work with a cross-cut saw to clear it. There was no way around. Frustrated, he turned his horse and decided to cut across the Hruby land, if only to get out of the wind that was scouring the lane. As he neared the strange cabin, he guided his horse towards the lee of the great iron firebox. The structure, cold and dormant, at least offered a break from the biting wind. He dismounted, his joints stiff, and leaned his back against the north wall of Stefan's cabin to catch his breath. He expected to feel the familiar, soul-sucking cold of ice-sheathed logs, a cold that felt like it could pull the life right out of you. He felt warmth. It was not a blast of heat. It was a gentle, pervasive, and utterly impossible warmth. It felt like leaning against a hearthstone hours after the fire has been banked. It radiated through his thick wool coat, through his layers of clothing, and settled deep into the frozen muscles of his back. He pressed his gloved palm flat against the logs. They were not just not cold, they were actively, miraculously warm. He stood there for a long moment, the wind howling past the corner of the house, his entire world of professional certainty dissolving against the side of a log wall. He looked at the firebox, silent and black 9 feet away. He looked at the insulated duct. He looked at the wall he was leaning on. In that moment, the master mason understood. The Slovak hadn't built a stove to heat his house. He had built a slow sunrise in the wall. Aegis never went inside. He never spoke to Stefan that day. He simply got back on his horse, a profound stillness in his mind, and rode home. The next day, in his leather-bound account book, under a new client entry, he wrote 2 words he had never written before: stove wall. He spent the rest of the winter observing the Hruby cabin from a distance, noting the single plume of smoke that rose for a few hours in the morning and evening, and the absence of the frantic activity that characterized every other homestead. He saw the children playing outside, rosy-cheeked and healthy. He saw a house at peace with the winter, not at war with it. When spring came, Wilbur Aegis began to preach a new gospel. When a client asked for a new fireplace, he would counter with a proposal for a stove wall. He explained the principle not with physics, but with a mason's practical language. The fire stays outside, he'd say. The heat soaks the brick, and the brick breathes warmth all day and all night. You don't feed the fire, you feed the wall. He was met with skepticism, but his reputation was unassailable. That spring, he got his first commission from a German family new to the area. He consulted with Stefan, who freely shared every detail of his design, sketching the flue's path in the dirt with a stick. Aegis built it, and it worked just as the original had. By the first snow of 1879, he had built 7 more, adapting the design for different layouts, becoming the region's foremost expert in a technology he had mocked only a year before. The name stuck. It was the stove wall, a piece of old-world wisdom that had found a new home in the unforgiving hills of Pennsylvania. The quiet iron worker from Spish had brought with him a principle that the New World had forgotten in its rush for new technologies. His innovation was, in fact, ancient. The Roman Hippocaust, the Korean Ondol, the German Kachelofen, all were based on the same idea of heating the mass of a dwelling, rather than the air within it. Today, his stove wall lives on in the concepts of radiant floor heating, high-efficiency masonry heaters, and the principles of passive solar design, which uses sun-warmed thermal mass to heat homes long after sunset. These modern systems, with their complex controls and engineered materials, are all chasing the same elegant efficiency that Stefan Hruby achieved with cast iron, brick, and a deep understanding of his craft. He knew that true comfort didn't come from a blast of hot air, but from a silent, steady source of radiant warmth. In the end, Stefan Hruby's contribution was a profound inversion of the frontier mindset. The settlers believed that survival meant conquering the wild, bringing its resources, its wood, its water, its fire, inside the fortress of the home. They built a sharp, adversarial boundary between the domestic and the natural. Stefan saw it differently. He understood that the harshest elements could be made to serve you, but only if you respected their nature. He didn't bring the wild, dangerous fire indoors. He taught the wall, the very barrier between fire and family, to do the carrying. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity valuable, please consider subscribing and liking this video to help us bring more hidden histories to light. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other historical technologies do you think deserve a second look today? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.